Other than a Bugatti, I don't think there's a specific car that I've chased harder but more unsuccessfully than Bentley. Over the years, I would guess that I've tried to buy at least 100 of them. I've wound up in lawsuits over Bentley deals, tried everything that I could, but really what it comes down to is that my normal strategy of lowballing cars was too aggressive for the Bentley marketplace. And that's because Bentleys have such a reputation of catastrophically crippling maintenance expenses that I guess when I normally just back down an offer from what I know sort of the worst case scenario is, it was just too low to ever get a deal done. But again, I've chased so many of them. But for the 8th series of Car Trek, Auto Tempest was challenging us to find the best gas-guzzling supercar that we could for the price of a Tesla Model 3. In the face of the electrification of the automobile, this idea that we could have one last hurrah in gas-guzzling, amazing performance cars was something that sounded like a great premise. And I had a sort of an idea of what the other guys might come up with, and it seemed like the perfect opportunity for me to finally buy a Bentley. It also allows us, generally with Car Trek, we are cushioned by Auto Tempest sponsorship. They don't buy us the cars, but we know that through that and through the revenue that we might get from the YouTube videos, it's okay if the car breaks. And in most cases, they do. And in most cases, that makes the series a little bit more entertaining. So I wanted to find the right Bentley. And generally, when you think about a Model 3, $30,000 to $45,000, you think, I'm going to buy a Bentley of that range. It's going to be an 04 to 07 early Continental GT. Generally sorted out, doesn't need to have that many miles. It could be a really nice car. I mean, you can buy Bentleys in the high teens or low 20s when they're really, really terrible. But I wanted a car that could generally be depended upon because I knew, as always, we would subject it to a series of challenges. So we set out to Auto Tempest website, which is quite honestly where me, Freddie, and Tyler search for our cars. It's the most powerful way to shop for any car. They even let you, which was particularly operative in this case, search nationally on Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist. Now, that's a great place to find in the nooks and crannies of the internet some of the worst cars available. And that's always what I'm looking for. I want to find something that, at least has a story to it, maybe some bad history. That always makes them cheaper, and it means that I can get a cooler version. And that is a fundamental problem with the Continental GT marketplace, because now in the year 2022, for a car that came out in 2003 as a 2004 model in the US, we've got 18 model years of cars that occupy a space of generally $20,000 to $300,000. But almost all of them are between, 40 and 125 grand. And the problem is when you have that many cars along that kind of a range, just a few dollars more always gets you a much cooler car. Because right when you think I'm going to go buy a $35,000 2006 that's ready, has good service records, you think, well, for a little bit more, I could get an '08 Speed, which has a cooler front bumper, a little bit more power, a few better colors, some better options, and it's just a little bit faster and more awesome. But then when you spend that money, you're like, well, for not much more, I can get a Supersports, which is one of the coolest versions of the car, has the Bugatti seats, you can get it as a 2+0 without a back seat and a carbon fiber harness bar. Just super awesome car, 621 horsepower, the most powerful car they'd made up to that point. But for the same money, you could get a really bad 2012, which was sort of the big evolution of the model, much better infotainment, a little bit more reliable. A lot of the things that were really scary about the early cars are sorted out, but it's not as cool. Just have a regular Continental GT rather than a Supersports. But then you could get a 13 or 14 Speed. And each of these steps is actually, an extra $3,000, $5,000, $10,000, whatever. And so you rationally and logically just end up upselling yourself all the way until you've won a Bring a Trailer auction by accident for an $85,000 Bentley Speed. Now, fortunately, the reserve didn't get met, but in the shopping process for these cars, I'm seeing just all these amazing options, but nothing really stood out until one popped up. A 2010 Bentley Supersports, which is kind of the ideal thing, but generally those are $80,000 to $100,000 cars. This one, though, had something about its history that made it much cheaper. It had 180,000 miles, or 178, I suppose. Insane for a Bentley. I mean, although they are Volkswagen products and they can go an awfully long time, it's not an insane specific output for a 6-liter W12. That's pretty nuts. And so it had the most miles I'd ever seen on a Continental GT, and it was the coolest model, a 2+0 Supersports. Now, the interesting thing about this car is that it had just been sold through a CarMax dealer auction. So that's where the dealer I had found advertising it had found this car. And generally, even though we know you can sell any car you want with a title to CarMax. They will just write you a check. There are plenty of cars that CarMax will not represent to the public, either because they can't put their CarMax bumper-to-bumper warranty that Doug DeMuro made famous, or just because they know it's not a great car to sell. A 200-ish thousand mile Bentley is not the car that you necessarily want to sell, and certainly there are no warranty products available for it. And so they sell in a closed dealer auction, just like Mannheim or Odessa, the cars to a dealer audience. And that's where this guy had bought it. And I love the idea. It was just covered in rock chips, black over black. I had the full carbon fiber interior. Carbon ceramic brakes were standard on those Supersports. I loved it. It was the perfect car. I ship it in from California, no PPI, no worry about it, whatever, it'll be fine. And it shows up and it is glorious. Although I have to say, we were out shooting something when it came in, so it actually went straight to the wrap shop, because shooting black cars for television is not a great idea. I don't like black cars, even though I guess like 5 out of the last 6 cars I bought were black. But regardless, it needed to be a better color. And I loved the rhodium green that Bentley had used on a special Pikes Peak edition on the latest Continental GT Speed. So my friends at Wrap Pros, we looked through all the different colors and found algae green and chose that for the car. And it came out absolutely perfect. It was exactly the right shade of green to go opposite Freddie and Tyler's cars for the series. Now, I won't spoil what we did with the cars, but I have to say, I think the first episode of Car Trek 8, which aired yesterday, is the best episode we've ever made. It was an amazing adventure. We actually shot it right after Amelia Island, and so I was getting into this luxurious Bentley after spending almost a week in the TVR. And while the TVR was a wonderfully intriguing and interesting car, it was absolutely miserable to drive, and so I was so happy to be in the Bentley. I'll also go so far as to say that even relative to the Manuel Gallardo Spider, the 599, the Vanquish, all of the great Car Trek cars that I've had, I think this was my favorite. I absolutely loved it. It was so comfortable, so powerful, so fast, so much fun. It looked so good. I would fit so well. It held all my luggage without any trouble. It was the ideal road trip car. It did, of course, as we would expect, show some reasons that someone might have dumped a Bentley to CarMax, because this would have been done in what is the hottest used car market that the world has ever seen. So even with 180,000 miles, there would have been people that wanted to buy the car. And so anytime you see a car that has brand new Pirelli tires, one at least brand new carbon ceramic rotor, and generally in running and driving condition at a CarMax, it's scary. And the dealer that I got it from had done no reconditioning to it whatsoever. So I knew that at some point along our journey, something would pop up. And it did. I was on our way to the first racetrack that we were going to use, and it starts to alarm in this horrifying way. It says that there is an oil pressure failure and we have to shut the engine off immediately. Now, I pull over the first time that happens and I'm like, all right, this is strange because the car is running perfectly, which an oil-starved car will seldom do. The temperatures are fine for oil and coolant. You know, it's not popping a check engine light at that point. It later did for an evaporative leak. And it became pretty clear eventually that this was not actually an issue with the oil pressure, but in fact the sensor for the oil pressure. Now, it would ding and really freak you out, you know, red errors on the dash, but eventually it really wasn't that big of a deal. We could drive right through it. Now, when Tyler drove the car for a little while, it alarmed him a bit, but he just decided not to tell me about it and just assumed it was not a big deal. So I appreciate his hoopty awareness in that sense. The other thing that the car did that was really, really strange is that the power steering would intermittently stop working, especially in the middle of a turn. And we took it to some pretty amazing roads, and that became very disconcerting. So I would assume it's one of those two things that were the reason why this guy just got fed up after he put, I think he bought it was a second owner with like 15,000 miles. So he put almost 200,000 miles on this car, and that was enough. So whether it was either of those issues or something that I didn't happen to see, that's what it was. So as soon as I got home, I had some of those issues attended to. We got a new oil pressure sensor. We got the check engine light addressed. We couldn't ever replicate the power steering issue. And I think on a lot of Audi Volkswagen products, when the power steering pump just gets too hot, it starts to fail intermittently because it wasn't necessarily a predictable pattern of the failure. Everything seemed okay. Nothing was leaking catastrophically. And so that just kind of went down the road. But I did relatively immediately list it on Auto Tempest for sale. So that was a tough thing to do, not because it took long to sell. I think I sold it within 48 hours, but I loved the car. I loved the way it looked. I loved the way it was set up. I loved the adventure that we've been able to take it on, but that was exactly why I wanted it to go away. I had had a very, very good Bentley ownership experience. And after buying it for $43,000, spending a couple grand to get it wrapped, and then fixing a few things, I was still well under $50,000 in the car, and I sold it very easily for 59 grand. And so it was a good profit. It was a great experience. I loved my first Bentley. And it set me up well to buy a nicer one, because obviously if it was just me buying a Supersports, I'm not gonna buy a 200,000 mile car. I'm gonna buy a 60, 70, 80,000 mile car that's still high miles and still cheap enough, but doesn't have that superlative to it. And I think that's probably what I will do at some point. I don't know that I want to drive a lot of miles in the next 2 years in a Bentley. I want to drive my Mercedes and do other things, but it was perfect. It was absolutely everything I wanted it to be. And honestly, it was my favorite Car Trek car so far. So again, thank you so much to Auto Tempest for making Car Trek possible. Please go watch Car Trek 8 Episode 1 on Tavarish's channel. Episode 2 will come out tomorrow, and 3 will come soon after that. We love them for their constant support of VINwiki and of Car Trek, but they're honestly the best place ever to shop for your next car. So right now, please, in order for us to keep doing all of this and having so much fun, and I can promise you it is as much fun as we can devise, go now to the link in the description below and search for your next car on Auto Tempest.